The briefing room at Camp Westridge smelled of burnt coffee and damp canvas, and at the long steel table sat 11 operators who had already decided she did not belong. Commander Hale glanced at her once, twice, then let his eyes drift past her as if she were a chair. She was small, soft-spoken, with hair pulled into a low braid and a notebook full of tight, careful handwriting. The men called her the librarian before she had even spoken. On the projector glowed a satellite photograph of a compound the team would assault in 48 hours, and Hale was halfway through explaining the breach point when she lifted one finger. Not her voice. "Sir," she said, almost apologetically, "the shadow on the eastern wall is wrong." The room went still. She walked to the screen and pointed to a thin gray smear no one had registered. "The sun angle is from the southwest, but that shadow leans north. Something is mounted above the window, probably a counter-optic or a fixed camera the imagery analysts missed. If we breach there, we are seen before we move." Hale stared at the photograph for a long time. Then he stared at her. The room did not laugh anymore. "So I want to ask you, before this story goes any further, have you ever met someone whose quietness turned out to be the most dangerous strength in the room? Tell me below." Her name was Petty Officer First Class Mara Ellen Voss, and long before the Navy ever taught her to read wind or count heartbeats between trigger pulls, she had already spent a childhood learning that patience was a form of love. She grew up on a small inland farm in Oregon, the youngest of 4, the only girl, and the only one who could sit beside her grandfather for 6 unbroken hours in a deer blind without fidgeting. Her grandfather had been a Korean War veteran who rarely spoke about combat, but spoke endlessly about stillness. He told her that most people lose what they want by reaching for it too soon, and that the woods reward the ones who wait until the woods forget they are there. Mara took that to heart in a way her brothers never did. While they wrestled and shouted and broke things, she watched. She watched the way the barn cat tracked sparrows without moving its tail. She watched the way her mother's hands trembled before bad news and steadied before good. She read library books on astronomy because the stars demanded patience, and on chess because the board punished impatience without mercy. By 14, she could field dress a rabbit and recite the Beaufort wind scale. By 17, she could sit through a high school cafeteria full of cruelty without ever raising her voice, which her classmates mistook for weakness and which her grandfather, who had seen real cruelty, recognized as armor. When she enlisted at 19, the recruiter asked her why the Navy and not the Army, and she said, simply, that she liked the discipline of water. He asked what role she wanted, and she said she wanted to be useful in a way that did not require her to be loud. He laughed, kindly, and told her the Navy was full of loud jobs. She thanked him and asked about the quiet ones. There were not many, but there were a few, and the quietest of them all was a path so narrow that only a handful of women had ever walked it. Precision marksmanship in support of special operations. She did not say she wanted that path. She only began, that night, walking toward it. She ran the long flat roads outside her hometown before sunrise. She lay belly down in cold fields with a borrowed scope, learning to read mirage shimmer above wheat. She wrote in her notebook every evening, not stories, but observations. The wind shifted at 1742 from northwest to north. The crow on the fence post lifted 3 seconds before the truck appeared on the highway. She was not preparing for glory. She was preparing for responsibility, which she already understood was the heavier of the two. Sniper school did not begin with a rifle. It began with a stopwatch, a clipboard, and an instructor named Master Chief Doran who told the candidates that anyone who thought this course was about shooting was already disqualified in his mind. There were 32 students on the first day and 8 of them women, which was the largest class of women the program had ever accepted, and Mara made a quiet note of that without comment. The first week was breath. Just breath. They lay on cold concrete pads for hours and learned to slow the rise and fall of their own chests until the heartbeat in the carotid artery became a metronome they could count without thinking. Doran walked between them with a feather, and any candidate whose chest disturbed the feather above a measured threshold was marked. Mara was not marked. The second week was mathematics, the kind that does not forgive sloppy arithmetic, because at 800 meters a misplaced decimal is the difference between a clean stop and a tragedy. They learned minutes of angle and milliradians. They learned the Coriolis effect and spin drift. They learned that a bullet flying for 1.5 seconds is long enough for the earth to move beneath it. Mara loved this week. She loved it the way some people love poetry, because the numbers had to be exact and the universe did not negotiate. The third week was observation. They were given pairs of binoculars and dropped at the edges of a wide grassy bowl, and they had to describe, on paper, every change in a target field across 8 hours. A fence post leaning 2 degrees more than yesterday. A patch of trampled grass behind a shrub. A bird that flushed from a thicket without visible cause, suggesting movement they could not yet see. Doran told them the rifle was the last tool they would ever reach for, and the eyes were the first, and most candidates would fail because they wanted to skip from the first tool to the last. Then came camouflage, and ghillie suits sewn by hand over weeks until the burlap and jute looked like something the earth itself had grown. Then came stalks across open ground at 20 meters an hour, where a single careless elbow could end a career. Then came endurance, the carrying of heavy packs through rain and through nights that did not seem to have an ending. And woven through all of it, like a quiet thread, was the lesson Mara already understood from her grandfather, when not to act. Doran said it on the final morning. He said that the hardest shot a sniper would ever take was the one she chose not to take, because it would have killed the wrong person, or the right person at the wrong moment, or because waiting another 14 seconds would save the entire mission. Of the 32 candidates, 11 graduated. Mara was one of them. She did not celebrate. She wrote in her notebook that the wind on graduation day was a steady 6 knots from the south, and that her grandfather, who had died the previous winter, would have been pleased by the weather but unsurprised by the result. Her first assignment placed her in a support cell attached to a SEAL platoon out of Little Creek, and the men of that platoon were not unkind, but they were also not ready for her. They were ready for someone louder. They were ready for the kind of sniper who told stories at the bar and clapped backs with calloused hands and laughed at the right jokes at the right volume. Mara did none of these things. She arrived with 1 duffel and 1 rifle case and a notebook, and when the platoon chief, a senior chief named Ruiz, asked her if she had any questions, she said only, "Where do I sleep? And where do I run?" Ruiz raised 1 eyebrow and said the barracks were down the hall and the track was behind the motor pool, and she nodded and disappeared. And for the first 3 weeks the men barely saw her. They saw the results of her, though. They saw her shooting scores posted on the board and assumed someone had made a clerical error. They saw her ruck times and assumed she had cut the course. They saw her sitting alone in the chow hall reading a book on atmospheric pressure, and one of the younger operators, a second-class petty officer named Briggs, decided she was arrogant. He decided this without ever speaking to her, which is how most decisions about quiet people are made. He started calling her ghost behind her back, and not in the affectionate way operators use such names. He meant it as if she were not really there. The misunderstanding deepened during a joint exercise in North Carolina. The platoon was running a hostage rescue scenario, and Mara was assigned to overwatch from a wooded ridge 900 meters out. Halfway through the exercise, a role-playing aggressor appeared at a window holding what looked like a rifle, and the platoon expected her to call the shot. She did not. She held. Briggs's voice came hot over the radio asking what the hell she was waiting for, and she answered, calmly, that the figure in the window was holding a broom handle and that 2 children were positioned behind him in the room. The exercise controllers later confirmed she was right. Briggs did not apologize. He grew quieter around her, which was its own kind of admission. Commander Hale, who ran the platoon, watched all of this from a careful distance. He had been suspicious of her at first, the same way he was suspicious of any new attachment, but Hale was a man who paid attention. He noticed that when Mara entered a room, she did not survey it for friends or threats. She surveyed it for facts. He noticed she remembered the names of the cooks and the janitors and the supply clerks, and that she did not remember them strategically, but the way someone remembers things she actually cares about. He began to suspect that the platoon had been given something rare and that the platoon, in its noise, had not yet realized it. He did not say so. Commanders rarely say such things out loud. But he started reading her after-action notes line by line, and he started keeping a copy of her observation reports in his desk. And on the night before their first real deployment together, he wrote in his own private journal the single sentence, "She sees what we do not." The deployment took them to a coastal region in the Horn of Africa. where the platoon was assigned to support a partner force operation against a small network suspected of running weapons through a fishing village called Daniel. The mission was not a raid. It was, the briefing emphasized, a presence and observation operation, with intervention authorized only if civilian lives were in immediate danger. The platoon would establish a hidden observation post on a low ridge overlooking the village's only road, and Mara, paired with a spotter named Petty Officer Tomas Kell, would hold the position for what was projected to be 4 days, perhaps 5. It became 11. The first thing that went wrong was the heat. The second was the wind, which shifted unpredictably off the Indian Ocean and forced them to recalculate firing solutions every hour they were not sleeping. The third was the village itself, which was not what the satellite photographs had suggested. The photographs had shown a quiet fishing settlement. The reality was a place of children and goats and old men mending nets. And Mara understood within the first 12 hours that any decision she made on this ridge would be made in front of a community, not against an enemy. She wrote that thought in her notebook in small, careful letters, and she underlined it once. On the 4th day, the suspected network's lead courier arrived in the village. He was younger than the intelligence packet had described, perhaps 22, and he moved through the streets the way a man moves who has grown up in those streets, greeting an aunt, accepting a piece of flatbread from a vendor, pausing to ruffle a child's hair. Kell, beside her, exhaled through his teeth and said, "That's him." Mara confirmed the identification with the photo card. Then she watched, and she did not call command, and Kell looked at her and asked why. She answered that the rules of engagement on this operation did not authorize a shot on a courier in a civilian crowd, and that even if they had, the angle through the alley would carry the round into the doorway of a house with 3 people inside. Kell, who was a good operator and a better man than he sometimes pretended to be, nodded once and said nothing more. They watched the courier for 6 more days. They mapped his routine. They identified his contacts. They noted the specific moment each evening when he stepped onto a flat roof alone to make a phone call, and they relayed this pattern, with timestamps and photographs, to the partner force, which used the information to arrest him bloodlessly on the 8th night, in a quiet operation that injured no one. Mara never fired her rifle on that deployment. She came home with 11 days of notes, 3 notebooks filled, and a quiet, immovable conviction that the patience her grandfather had taught her in a deer blind in Oregon had, somewhere along the way, become a form of mercy. Hale read her after-action report twice. Then he asked her, in his office, what she had been thinking on the 4th day when she chose not to call the shot. She said she had been thinking about the child whose hair the courier had ruffled, and about the doorway behind him, and about the fact that the mission did not need a death to succeed. Hill was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Voss, if you ever leave this platoon, I will take it personally." She did not smile, but she did, very slightly, nod. The mission everyone in the platoon would later remember as the one that changed them began as a routine extraction. A small State Department team had been conducting a humanitarian assessment in a contested mountain district, and a sudden shift in the local power balance had left them stranded in a guest house with deteriorating security around them. The platoon was sent in by helicopter at last light to bring them out, and Mara was inserted with Kell 2 ridgelines away to provide overwatch on the approach road and the guest house compound. Hale led the ground element personally, which was unusual for a commander of his rank, but Hale had a way of going where the risk was, and his men loved him for it, even when they wished he would not. The complication arrived in the form of a pickup truck full of armed men that had not been on any intelligence picture, which rolled to a stop at the only bridge between the compound and the extraction point. The men were not professional fighters. They were younger, jumpier, more dangerous in the way that untrained armed men are always more dangerous than trained ones, because they do not know what they will do until they do it. Hale's element was pinned on the wrong side of the bridge with the State Department team. Through her scope, 840 meters out, Mara watched the standoff develop. She could hear Hale's voice on the radio, low and even, attempting to negotiate passage in a language the local interpreter was translating in real time. She watched the body language of the youngest of the armed men, a boy who could not have been more than 19, and she watched his hands tighten and loosen around his weapon in a rhythm she recognized from training films and from her own first weeks on a range. when fear made fingers do things their owners had not yet decided. She did not call the shot. What she called instead was a detail. She told Hale, over the radio, that the man on the far left of the group was the one the others kept glancing at, and that if he relaxed, the rest would relax. She told him the wind on the bridge was currently moving from Hale's back toward the armed men, which meant his voice would carry clearly and theirs would not, and that he should slow his speech, lower his volume, and let them lean in to listen. She told him that the boy on the right was about to do something, and that if Hale could give the older man on the left a small concession, any concession, in the next 30 seconds, the boy would look to the older man and would not act. Hale did exactly that. He offered to leave one of the platoon's vehicles at the bridge as a gesture of good faith, a vehicle the platoon could afford to lose and that the local men, in that moment, could not refuse. The older man on the left lowered his weapon by an inch. The boy on the right looked to him. The standoff dissolved over the next 4 minutes, not into peace exactly, but into the kind of grudging passage that allowed Hale's element and the State Department team to cross the bridge and reach the extraction point without a single shot fired. Mara did not fire her rifle that night either. She did, however, sit on the ridge for another 2 hours after exfil, watching the bridge through her scope until she was certain the armed men had truly gone home, because she could not bear the thought that the village she had just helped save would be punished after she left. When she finally stood up, Kel looked at her and said, quietly, "You talked him through that, didn't you?" She said she had only described what she saw. Kel shook his head. "No," he said. "You talked him through that." On the helicopter ride back, Hale sat across from her and did not speak, but he reached over once and put his hand briefly on her shoulder. And that was the only thing he needed to say. The story of how the platoon came to understand her did not happen in a single moment, which is fitting because Mara herself did not believe in single moments. It happened in small increments over the following months. It happened when Briggs, the operator who had once called her ghost behind her back, came to her cot one evening and asked, awkwardly, if she would help him work on his observation skills, because his last qualification had been weaker than he wanted to admit. She said yes without making him feel small for asking, and she spent 3 weekends with him on a borrowed range, teaching him to read mirage and to count the seconds between a flag's movements. And Briggs never called her ghost again, not even affectionately, because he had learned by then that her real name was a thing worth saying. It happened when the platoon's youngest member, a new arrival named Park, broke down quietly one night after a difficult training rotation, and it was Mara he found himself talking to, not because she offered comfort, but because she offered the rare gift of listening without interrupting and without trying to fix him. It happened when Hale, in front of the entire platoon during a debrief, referred to her observation report as the standard he expected from every operator in the room. And when he said her name, he said it the way you say the name of someone you trust with your life, which by then he did. The deepest understanding, though, came on a wet morning in late autumn, when the platoon gathered in a side room of the squadron headquarters for what was supposed to be a routine safety stand-down and turned out to be something else. Hale stood at the front of the room and told the men that the Navy had selected one operator from their unit to receive a commendation for actions over the past 18 months, and that the operator was Petty Officer First Class Mara Ellen Voss. He read the citation aloud. It described, in the careful neutral language of military awards, a pattern of decisions that had preserved civilian lives, protected the platoon, and advanced the mission without the discharge of her weapon in anger on a single occasion. When he finished reading, the room was silent for a moment, and then Briggs began to clap, and then Kel, and then all of them. And Mara, who had spent her whole life preferring not to be looked at, looked instead at the floor for a long second before lifting her eyes and meeting Hale's gaze with the smallest nod she had ever given anyone. The men of that platoon, who had once mistaken her quiet for weakness, and then for arrogance, and then for distance, finally understood that what they had been seeing all along was none of those things. It was control. It was the kind of control that does not announce itself, the kind that is built out of 1,000 small refusals to act on impulse. The kind that her grandfather had begun teaching her in a deer blind in Oregon when she was 8 years old, and that she had carried, without fanfare, all the way into a room full of operators who had finally learned how to see her. If you walked past Mara Voss today on a quiet street in a quiet town, You would not pick her out of a crowd. She is still small. She is still soft-spoken. She still carries a notebook, and she still writes in it in tight, careful handwriting, observations about weather and wind, and the way strangers behave when they do not know they are being watched. She is older now, and she teaches at the school where she once trained. And the candidates who pass through her classroom rarely understand on the first day what kind of person is standing in front of them. They understand by the last day. What her story leaves behind is not a legend of impossible shots or cinematic heroics, because her career contained almost none of those. What her story leaves behind is something more valuable and far rarer. The reminder that the most dangerous strength a human being can develop is not the ability to act, but the ability to decide. Again and again, when not to. Her greatest weapon was never the rifle in her hands. It was the discipline in her mind, refined through years of breathing slowly when others breathed fast, of watching when others rushed, of staying silent when others demanded noise. It was the responsibility in her heart, the deep refusal to spend a life she did not have to spend, the unshakable conviction that mercy and competence are not opposites but partners. The men she served with came home because of her, and so did people whose names she never learned, in villages whose names she will not say out loud. And that quiet arithmetic of preserved lives is the only ledger she has ever cared about. So if anyone ever tells you that strength must be loud to be real, remember the woman who proved otherwise, one held breath at a time.